Harlem, 116th Street, midnight. The bitter February wind of 1967 cut through the tenements like a blade, carrying with it the distant sound of jazz from the Apollo Theater and the ever-present smell of coal smoke from basement furnaces. 17-year-old Frank Lucas clutched the stolen Zenith television against his chest, his breath coming in sharp puffs as he ran through the shadows cast by flickering streetlights. The 21-inch screen felt like it weighed 100 pounds, but Frank couldn't let go. This television represented his family's rent money for an entire month. The alarm from Morningside Heights Electronics had been shrieking for what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed since Frank had smashed through the back door with a crowbar he'd found in an alley. He had expected a simple grab-and-run operation, something to put food on his family's table and keep the landlord from evicting them from their rat-infested apartment on Malcolm X Boulevard. What he hadn't expected was a security system that seemed to light up half of Manhattan. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Frank's sneakers, worn thin from months of walking Harlem's unforgiving streets, slapped against the wet pavement as he ducked between parked cars and sprinted past the closed storefronts that lined the avenue. Pawn shops, record stores, and small groceries sat silent behind their metal security gates, their neon signs casting an eerie glow over the nearly deserted street. As Frank rounded the corner onto 116th Street, his lungs burning from the cold air and exertion, he stopped dead in his tracks. Standing directly in his path as if he had materialized from the shadows themselves, was a figure that every person in Harlem knew by reputation, even if they had never seen him in person. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson. 62 years old, though his bearing suggested a man who had never allowed age to diminish his presence. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal cashmere overcoat that probably cost more than Frank's family made in 6 months, and his black leather shoes gleamed despite the wet streets. In his right hand, he carried an ebony walking stick topped with a silver handle, not because he needed assistance walking, but because it had become as much a part of his identity as his reputation for being the most feared and respected man in all of Harlem. "Stop running, son," Bumpy said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 4 decades commanding respect in one of America's toughest neighborhoods. There was no anger in his tone, no urgency. He spoke as if he were asking Frank to pass the salt at dinner. Put that television on the ground. Frank's mind raced as he stood frozen in the middle of the street. Everyone in Harlem knew stories about Bumpy Johnson. Some said he had killed Dutch Schultz with his bare hands back in 1935. Others claimed he had connections that reached all the way to City Hall and the mayor's office. Frank had heard his mother whisper Bumpy's name when she thought the children weren't listening, usually in the context of why certain blocks were safe to walk through and others weren't. But standing here now, face to face with the man himself, Frank felt something he hadn't expected. Yes, there was fear. A deep, primal recognition that he was in the presence of someone who held the power of life and death in his hands. But there was also something else. Curiosity. This man could have simply walked past, could have pretended not to see a young thief running through his territory with stolen goods. Instead, he had chosen to stop. Why? "Did you hear what I said?" Bumpy asked again, taking a single step forward. His eyes, Frank noticed, never left Frank's face. He wasn't looking at the television, wasn't checking the street for police cars. His entire attention was focused on studying the young man standing before him. Slowly, Frank lowered the television to the sidewalk. He kept his eyes locked on Bumpy's, some instinct telling him that looking away would be interpreted as either weakness or disrespect, both of which could prove fatal in this moment. "What's your name, son?" Frank Lucas." "How old are you, Frank?" 17. "Where do you live?" "Malcolm X Boulevard, with my mother and my brothers and sisters." Bumpy moved closer, close enough that Frank could smell his cologne, something expensive and sophisticated that seemed entirely out of place in the middle of a Harlem street at midnight. But nothing about Bumpy Johnson seemed to follow the normal rules that governed other people's lives. "Tell me something, Frank Lucas," Bumpy said, pronouncing each syllable of Frank's name carefully, as if he were committing it to memory. "Why do you steal?" It wasn't the question Frank had been expecting. Most adults, when they caught him doing something wrong, asked, "What were you thinking?" or "Don't you know better?" But Bumpy was asking why, as if stealing were a philosophical position rather than a crime. "Because we don't have any money," Frank answered honestly. There seemed to be no point in lying to this man. "Wrong answer," Bumpy replied immediately. "Try again. Tell me the real reason." Frank felt his stomach drop. He had never articulated the real reason to anyone, had barely admitted it to himself during the long, hungry nights when he lay awake in the bedroom he shared with 3 younger brothers. But somehow, under Bumpy's steady gaze, the truth came tumbling out. "Because I'm powerless," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper, "and I want to be powerful." For the first time since they had begun talking, Bumpy smiled. It was a small smile, calculated and knowing. The smile of a man who had just heard exactly what he had hoped to hear. "Now that," Bumpy said, "is the right answer. You want power, but you're looking for it in all the wrong places." He gestured toward the television, sitting on the sidewalk between them. "Stealing that television doesn't make you powerful, Frank. It makes you a thief, and thieves, no matter how clever they think they are, always get caught eventually." Frank's confusion must have shown on his face, because Bumpy continued without waiting for a response. "Power doesn't come from taking what belongs to other people. Power comes from building something that belongs to you. Power comes from making yourself so valuable that other people need you more than you need them." The distant sound of police sirens had faded away. The officers had apparently given up their search and moved on to other crimes, other emergencies. But Frank barely noticed. His entire world had narrowed to this conversation, to these words that seemed to be reshaping everything he thought he understood about how life worked. "How do I do that?" Frank asked. "How do I become powerful?" "Follow me," Bumpy said simply. "And learn." Without another word, Bumpy turned and began walking down 116th Street toward Lenox Avenue. After a moment's hesitation, Frank abandoned the stolen television and fell into step beside him. Neither of them looked back. Lenox Avenue at midnight was a different world from the rest of Harlem. While other streets grew quiet after dark, Lenox pulsed with a life that seemed to have its own rhythm, its own rules. The Red Rooster restaurant sat on the corner like a beacon, its red neon sign casting colored light across the faces of the men and women who moved through the shadows. Some Frank recognized as local residents, people who worked in the shops and factories that provided employment for Harlem's working class. Others were clearly from somewhere else, white men in expensive suits who looked uncomfortable but determined. Their presence a reminder that certain kinds of business transcended racial boundaries when enough money was involved. Bumpy led Frank past the restaurant's main entrance, and around to a narrow door that opened onto a steep staircase. They climbed 2 flights in silence, their footsteps echoing off the worn wooden steps. At the top, Bumpy produced a key and opened a door marked only with the number 3. The apartment beyond was like nothing Frank had ever seen. The main room served as an office, but it was an office that spoke of taste and refinement that seemed impossible given its location above a Harlem restaurant. Persian rugs covered the floor, and the walls were lined with framed photographs that made Frank stop and stare in amazement. There was Bumpy, 20 years younger, standing next to Duke Ellington outside the Cotton Club. Another photo showed him shaking hands with Sugar Ray Robinson after one of the boxers' victories at Madison Square Garden. In a corner, a framed picture captured Bumpy deep in conversation with Malcolm X, both men wearing serious expressions as they discussed something that was clearly of great importance. But the photograph that dominated the room hung behind Bumpy's desk in a place of honor. It was a front page from the New York Times, dated March 15, 1935. The headline read, "Harlem Numbers King Defeats Dutch Schultz Organization." "Sit down, Frank," Bumpy said, settling into a leather chair behind his desk. "It's time for your first lesson." Frank took the chair opposite the desk, his eyes still taking in the details of the room. On a side table, he noticed a chess set with pieces carved from what looked like ivory and ebony. The board was set up in the middle of a game, as if Bumpy had been playing against an invisible opponent. "That newspaper," Frank said, nodding toward the framed headline. "It means," Bumpy replied, "that 32 years ago, I learned the most important lesson of my life. And tonight, I'm going to teach that lesson to you. Bumpy stood and walked to the window that overlooked Lenox Avenue. Below them, the street continued its midnight ballet of commerce and survival, but from this height, it looked almost peaceful. Dutch Schultz was a white man who thought he could come into Harlem and take over the numbers business. He had money, he had guns, and he had connections with corrupt police officers who were willing to look the other way as long as they got their cut. Most people in this neighborhood assumed that when Dutch Schultz wanted something, Dutch Schultz got it. Frank leaned forward in his chair, captivated by the story. But Dutch Schultz made a mistake. Bumpy continued. He thought power came from fear. He thought if he could make people afraid of him, they would give him what he wanted. So he started beating up numbers runners, threatening shop owners, burning down businesses that wouldn't pay his protection fees. Did it work? Frank asked. For a while, Bumpy admitted. Fear is a powerful motivator, especially when people don't see any alternative. But fear only works as long as the person causing it seems stronger than everyone else. The moment someone proves that the feared person can be defeated, the fear disappears. And when fear disappears, it's usually replaced by anger. Bumpy turned away from the window and looked directly at Frank. I didn't defeat Dutch Schultz with guns or money or corrupt cops. I defeated him by proving to the people of Harlem that there was another way. Instead of taking from the community, I protected it. Instead of making people afraid, I made them feel safe. Instead of working against the neighborhood, I worked for it. Frank was beginning to understand, but he needed to hear it spelled out clearly. So the lesson is, Bumpy said, settling back into his chair, is the first rule I'm going to teach you. And if you learn nothing else from our time together, learn this. Rule number 1. Never work just for money. Bumpy let the words hang in the air for a moment, before continuing. Look out that window, Frank. Every corner you can see has one of my people watching it. Every business owner on this street knows they can call on me if they have trouble. Every parent in this neighborhood trusts me to keep their children safe from the worst elements that try to move in from other areas. But everyone says you're a criminal, Frank said, immediately regretting the words as soon as they left his mouth. Instead of anger, Bumpy showed only amusement. I am a criminal, Frank, but I'm Harlem's criminal. That makes all the difference in the world. He opened a desk drawer and pulled out a ledger book, its pages filled with columns of numbers written in a neat, precise hand. Every week I take in thousands of dollars from the numbers game, from poker games, from various other enterprises that operate in this neighborhood. But every week I also spend thousands of dollars protecting this neighborhood. I pay for groceries for families that are struggling. I make sure kids have school supplies. I settle disputes before they turn violent. I keep the worst elements, the ones who would turn this place into a war zone, from getting a foothold. Frank studied the ledger pages as Bumpy turned them. It was like looking at the budget for a small city. The Italians come into neighborhoods like this to extract money, Bumpy explained. They take everything they can and give back nothing. They don't live here, they don't care about the people here, and they don't have any investment in whether this community thrives or dies. But I live here. This is my home. These are my people. When I make money, I make sure some of it stays in the neighborhood. So you're saying I shouldn't want to make money? Frank asked. I'm saying money should never be your primary motivation. Money is a tool, not a goal. The goal should be to build something that matters, something that lasts, something that makes you genuinely valuable to the people around you. When you do that, money becomes a natural byproduct. Bumpy closed the ledger and returned it to the desk drawer. Dutch Schultz was motivated by greed that made him short-sighted and ultimately self-destructive. He couldn't see beyond the immediate profit, so he never built anything sustainable. When I challenged him, his own methods turned against him. The people he had terrorized were happy to help me get rid of him. Frank was beginning to see the wisdom in what Bumpy was saying, but he still had questions. But if you're not just trying to make money, how do you decide what to do? How do you know which opportunities to take and which ones to pass up? That, Bumpy said with a smile, brings us to tomorrow night's lesson. Rule number 2 is going to require a little field trip. As if on cue, a church bell somewhere in the distance chimed 1 o'clock. Bumpy stood and walked Frank to the door. Go home. Frank Lucas. Get some sleep. Tomorrow night, meet me here at 10 o'clock. Wear the best clothes you have, and make sure you've had a good meal. Where we're going, you're going to need your strength and your wits about you. Frank made his way down the stairs and out onto Lenox Avenue, his head spinning with everything he had heard. The stolen television was gone, probably picked up by someone who had more immediate need for it than questions about its origin. But Frank found that he didn't care. Something much more valuable had taken its place. The next evening, Frank stood outside the Red Rooster at exactly 10 o'clock, wearing his only decent shirt and a pair of pants his mother had pressed with an iron heated on the stove. He had spent the day thinking about Bumpy's words, replaying the conversation over and over in his mind until he had memorized every detail. His younger brothers had peppered him with questions about where he had been the night before, but Frank had simply told them he had been walking around the neighborhood. Some truths were too important to share casually. Bumpy appeared from the restaurant's main entrance, dressed even more formally than he had been the night before. His black suit looked like it had been tailored by someone who understood that clothing could be a form of armor, and his silk tie was held in place by a gold pin that caught the light from the street lamps. He carried the same walking stick, but tonight Frank noticed that the silver handle was actually carved into the shape of a chess piece, a king. "Good evening, Frank," Bumpy said, checking his pocket watch. "Right on time. That's important in this business. Punctuality shows respect, and respect is the foundation of everything we do." A black Cadillac DeVille pulled up to the curb, its engine purring with the quiet confidence that came from meticulous maintenance. The driver, a man Frank recognized as one of Bumpy's associates from the neighborhood, nodded respectfully as Bumpy opened the rear door. "Where are we going?" Frank asked, as he settled into the leather seat beside Bumpy. "The Bronx," Bumpy replied. "There's a meeting tonight that's going to determine the future of New York City's drug trade. You're going to observe, listen, and learn. But remember, you're there as my guest, not as a participant. Watch everything, but say nothing unless I specifically ask for your input." As the Cadillac made its way north through the city, Bumpy began explaining the complex web of relationships that governed illegal commerce in New York. The Italian families controlled most of the heroin coming into the city from overseas, but they relied on local distributors to get their product to the street level. In Harlem, that had traditionally meant working with established figures like Bumpy, who had the respect and infrastructure necessary to move large quantities without attracting unwanted attention from law enforcement. "The situation is changing," Bumpy said, watching the city lights slide past the car's windows. "Heroin is becoming bigger business than anyone anticipated. The demand is growing faster than the supply, which means there's more money than ever before. And when there's more money, there's more temptation for people to get greedy and make stupid decisions." The meeting was being held in a restaurant in Little Italy, a small place that served as neutral ground for discussions between different criminal organizations. Frank followed Bumpy through a rear entrance and into a private dining room where 8 men sat around a table covered with white linen and set with expensive china. The conversation stopped when they entered. Frank recognized the dynamic immediately, even though he had never been in a room like this before. There were the Italians, 3 men in their 50s and 60s, whose suits and manner suggested they were accustomed to being the most important people in any room they entered. There were 2 other black men Frank didn't recognize, both younger than Bumpy, but carrying themselves with the careful confidence of people who had earned their place at this table through years of careful work. And then there was Bumpy, who commanded the attention of everyone present simply by walking into the room. "Gentlemen," said one of the Italians, a heavy-set man with silver hair and hands that looked like they had never done physical labor. "Mr. Johnson, thank you for joining us tonight." "The pleasure is mine, Mr. Genovese," Bumpy replied, taking his seat at the table. Frank remained standing behind Bumpy's chair, as instructed. For the next hour, Frank listened to a conversation that was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. The men discussed heroin shipments the way other businessmen might discuss steel or automobiles: quantities, prices, delivery schedules, and quality control measures. But underneath the business language, Frank could sense tensions that had nothing to do with profit margins. The Italians wanted to increase the volume of heroin flowing into Harlem, which meant higher profits for everyone involved. But they also wanted to maintain their position as the sole suppliers, which meant that distributors like Bumpy would become increasingly dependent on their goodwill. Several times during the conversation, Frank noticed subtle threats disguised as business proposals. "The thing is, Bumpy," Mr. Genovese said during a discussion about pricing structures, "loyalty has to work both ways. We've been generous partners, but we need to know that our friends understand the importance of exclusivity." "I've always honored our agreements," Bumpy replied calmly. "But I've also always maintained the right to make decisions that are best for my organization and my community." The tension in the room became palpable. Frank could see the other black distributors shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly uncertain about how far this confrontation might escalate. "Of course," Mr. Genovese said, with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "We're all businessmen here. We all understand the importance of maintaining profitable relationships." The meeting concluded with handshakes and polite farewells, but Frank could tell that nothing had really been resolved. As they rode back to Harlem in the Cadillac, he waited for Bumpy to explain what they had just witnessed. "What did you see in there, Frank?" Bumpy asked. Frank considered his answer carefully. "I saw people who are supposed to be partners, but who don't trust each other." "Good. What else?" "The Italians want to control everything. Not just their part of the business. They want you to be dependent on them, so they can dictate terms." "Excellent. And what does that tell you about the nature of our current arrangement?" Frank thought about it for several blocks before responding. "It tells me that as long as you need them more than they need you, you're not really in control of your own business." Bumpy nodded approvingly. "Which brings us to tonight's lesson. Rule number 2. Rule number 2. Never eliminate the middleman." Frank looked confused. "But didn't you just explain why being the middleman is a problem?" "I explained why being dependent on someone else's middleman is a problem," Bumpy clarified. "But that's very different from eliminating middlemen entirely. Let me explain." As the Cadillac pulled up in front of the Red Rooster, Bumpy continued his explanation. "In any complex business operation, middlemen serve important functions. They provide buffers between you and your customers. They absorb risks that you don't want to take personally. They allow you to maintain distance from the aspects of the business that might attract unwanted attention from law enforcement." They climbed the stairs to Bumpy's office, where he poured 2 glasses of bourbon and settled into his chair behind the desk. "The Italians supply heroin to me, and I supply it to street-level dealers. I never touch the product directly, I never deal with end users, and I never handle the kind of small-scale transactions that typically attract police attention. If someone gets arrested for selling drugs on a street corner, they can't implicate me because they've never met me." Frank was beginning to understand the logic, but he still had questions. "So you're saying I should always work through other people?" "I'm saying you should structure your operations so that there are layers between you and anything that could destroy you. The more successful you become, the more important this becomes." Bumpy opened his desk drawer and pulled out a hand-drawn organizational chart that looked like a family tree turned upside down. "This is how my operation works. I'm at the top, but I only deal directly with 5 people. Those 5 people each manage their own networks of distributors, and those distributors work with the street-level dealers. If the police arrest a dealer, he can only give them information about his immediate distributor. If they arrest a distributor, he can only give them information about his manager. It would take law enforcement years of careful investigation to work their way up to me." "But doesn't that mean you make less money?" Frank asked. "Every person in the chain takes a cut. In the short term, yes. But in the long term it means I stay out of prison and keep making money while my competitors get arrested and shut down. The goal isn't to maximize profit on individual transactions. The goal is to build a sustainable operation that can continue generating profit for years or decades." Bumpy put the chart away and refilled their glasses. "More importantly, middlemen serve another crucial function. They provide you with what we call plausible deniability. If someone accuses me of selling heroin, I can truthfully say that I've never sold heroin to anyone. I've sold it to my distributors, and what they do with it after that is their business. Frank was impressed by the sophistication of the system, but he also saw potential weaknesses. What happens if one of your middlemen decides to cut you out and work directly with the Italians? That, Bumpy said with a grim smile, is why loyalty is so important, and why rule number 1, never work just for money, is so crucial. If your people are only working for you because you pay them, they'll leave as soon as someone offers them more money. But if they're working for you because they believe in what you're building, because they benefit from being part of your organization in ways that go beyond just money, then they have reasons to stay loyal even when temptation arises. The lesson was becoming clear to Frank. Building a criminal organization wasn't that different from building any other kind of business. You needed systems, you needed loyal employees, and you needed to think strategically about long-term sustainability rather than just short-term profits. There's one more thing, Bumpy said, his expression becoming more serious. Rule number 2 also applies to your sources of supply. Right now I buy heroin from the Italians because they control the supply chain from overseas. But that makes me dependent on them, which puts me in a vulnerable position. So what's the solution? That, Bumpy said, standing and walking to the window, is going to be rule number 3. But you're not ready for that lesson yet. First, you need to spend more time learning how the current system works. Knowledge is power, Frank. But incomplete knowledge is dangerous. As Frank made his way home through the quiet streets of Harlem, he reflected on everything he had learned over the past 2 nights. The world of organized crime was far more complex and sophisticated than he had ever imagined, governed by principles that seemed to apply to legitimate business as well. But what struck him most was Bumpy's emphasis on patience and long-term thinking. Everything about Bumpy's approach was designed to build something sustainable rather than to grab quick profits and run. 3 months passed before Bumpy summoned Frank for the final lesson. During that time, Frank had been working various jobs around Harlem, delivering packages for local businesses, running errands for shop owners, and gradually building a reputation as someone who could be trusted with small but important tasks. Bumpy had instructed him to learn the neighborhood's rhythms, to understand how legitimate commerce flowed alongside the underground economy. But Frank could sense that something was changing. Bumpy moved more slowly than he had before, and there were days when he seemed to struggle for breath after climbing the stairs to his office. The man who had once commanded rooms full of dangerous criminals through sheer force of presence now seemed to be fighting a battle that couldn't be won through intelligence or intimidation. On a humid evening in late September 1968, Frank received word that Bumpy wanted to see him urgently. When he arrived at the Red Rooster, he found his mentor sitting behind his desk with papers spread out before him, maps, photographs, and what looked like military documents. "Sit down, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice carrying a weight that Frank had never heard before. "It's time for you to learn the most important lesson I can teach you, and the most dangerous." Frank took his usual chair, but tonight the atmosphere felt different. There was a finality to Bumpy's manner that suggested this might be their last conversation as teacher and student. "Everything I've taught you so far has been preparation for this moment," Bumpy began. "The first rule, never work just for money, will keep you focused on building something meaningful. The second rule, never eliminate the middleman, will keep you out of prison. But if you want to build real power, if you want to create something that can't be taken away from you by men like those Italians we met with, then you need to understand the third rule." Bumpy pushed one of the maps across the desk. Frank could see it showed Southeast Asia, with certain areas marked in red ink. Rule number 3, find your own source. "The reason the Italians can dictate terms to distributors like me," Bumpy explained, "is because they control the supply chain from the point of origin. They have connections in Sicily, in France, in Turkey, all the places where opium gets processed into heroin and then shipped to America. As long as they're the only ones who can provide the product, they can set whatever prices they want and impose whatever conditions they choose." Frank studied the map, noting the areas that had been highlighted. "So you're saying we need to find our own suppliers?" "I'm saying more than that," Bumpy replied, pulling out several black and white photographs. "I'm saying we need to go directly to the source. And right now, the best source in the world is in Southeast Asia." The photographs showed American soldiers in Vietnam, but these weren't the kind of pictures Frank had seen in newspapers or on television. These soldiers were clearly off duty, standing in front of buildings that looked more like warehouses than military installations. Vietnam, Bumpy said, as if reading Frank's thoughts. American boys are fighting a war over there, but that's not the only business being conducted. The Golden Triangle, that's what they call the region where Burma, Laos, and Thailand meet, produces the purest heroin in the world. And American military transport planes fly back and forth between there and the United States every single day. Frank felt his mouth go dry. You're talking about using military planes to smuggle heroin. I'm talking about recognizing opportunity when it presents itself, Bumpy replied. Wars create chaos, and chaos creates opportunities for people who are smart enough to see them. Some of those American soldiers over there have figured out that they can make more money in a month than the military pays them in a year, just by using a little bit of space in cargo planes that are coming back to the States anyway. Bumpy spread out more documents. What appeared to be flight schedules, personnel lists, and contact information. I've been building relationships with certain individuals who are in position to help with this kind of arrangement. Some of them are pilots, some work in cargo handling, and some are just soldiers who need money to send home to their families. The point is, if we can establish direct connections with the source in Southeast Asia, we can eliminate our dependence on the Italian middlemen entirely. The scope of what Bumpy was proposing began to dawn on Frank. This wasn't just about finding a new supplier, this was about fundamentally restructuring the entire East Coast drug trade. How pure is the heroin from Southeast Asia compared to what the Italians bring in? Frank asked. About 90% pure, Bumpy replied. The stuff the Italians sell us has been cut so many times by the time it reaches New York that it's maybe 20% pure. If we could bring in pure product and cut it ourselves, we could sell it at half the price of the Italian product and still make 3 times the profit. Frank could see the mathematical beauty of the proposition, but he also understood the risks involved. What happens when the Italians find out we're cutting them out of the business? That, Bumpy said grimly, is why this conversation is so important. Once you go down this path, there's no turning back. You'll have made enemies of some of the most dangerous people in America. You'll be operating on a scale that will attract attention from federal law enforcement agencies. And you'll be involved in activities that could get you executed for treason if the wrong people decide you're a threat to national security. Bumpy leaned back in his chair, studying Frank's face carefully. I'm 62 years old, Frank. My heart is failing, my body is breaking down, and I don't have many years left. I've built something significant here in Harlem, but it's not going to survive the changes that are coming. The heroin trade is about to explode in ways that will make everything we've done up to this point look small. Either someone from this neighborhood positions themselves to take advantage of that explosion, or will be swept aside by people who don't care about this community. Frank felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. Everything in his life had been leading to this moment, to this choice. Why me? He asked. Why not one of your other people? Because you understand all 3 rules, Bumpy replied. You're not motivated primarily by money, so you won't make the short-sighted decisions that destroy most criminal organizations. You understand the importance of maintaining distance between yourself and the street-level operations. And most importantly, you're young enough and smart enough to build something that can last for decades. Over the next 2 hours, Bumpy shared details about contacts in Vietnam, about how military transport worked, about the logistics of moving large quantities of heroin from Southeast Asia to New York. It was like receiving a master's degree in international drug trafficking in a single evening. When their conversation finally ended, Frank understood that his life had been permanently changed. He was no longer a street-level thief looking for his next score. He was being offered the opportunity to become one of the most powerful criminal figures in American history. 3 months later, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson suffered a massive heart attack while eating dinner at Wells Restaurant on Lenox Avenue. He was pronounced dead at Harlem Hospital at 11:47 p.m. on July 7, 1968. Frank Lucas attended the funeral, standing in the front row among the hundreds of mourners who came to pay their respects to the man who had ruled Harlem for 4 decades. But even as he grieved for his mentor, Frank's mind was already focused on the future. 6 months after Bumpy's death, Frank made his first trip to Southeast Asia. Using the contacts and methods Bumpy had provided, He established relationships with suppliers in the Golden Triangle and with American military personnel who were willing to help transport heroin back to the United States in exchange for substantial payments. The product Frank brought back was unlike anything that had ever been seen on the streets of New York. He called it blue magic, and it was so pure and potent that users who were accustomed to heavily cut Italian heroin were getting high from quantities that had previously been ineffective. Within 2 years, Frank Lucas had built a drug empire that generated over $1 million per day. He followed Bumpy's 3 rules religiously. He reinvested profits into his community and his organization, rather than simply accumulating personal wealth. He maintained multiple layers of middlemen between himself and street-level operations, and he controlled his own supply chain from source to distribution. But success brought attention, and attention brought federal law enforcement. In 1975, Detective Richie Roberts and the Drug Enforcement Administration finally accumulated enough evidence to arrest Frank Lucas and dismantle his organization. Frank was sentenced to 70 years in prison, though he ultimately served only 15 years by cooperating with federal authorities to prosecute other drug traffickers. Years later, Frank would reflect on the irony of his situation. Bumpy Johnson had taught him everything he needed to know to build a criminal empire, but had died before he could teach him the most important lesson of all: how to know when to walk away. The 3 rules that had made Frank Lucas wealthy and powerful: never work just for money, never eliminate the middleman, and find your own source, had also created the conditions for his eventual downfall. His success had grown beyond what could be sustained without attracting overwhelming law enforcement attention. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88, having spent his final years as a cautionary tale about the limitations of even the most sophisticated criminal enterprises. The story of Bumpy Johnson and Frank Lucas remains a reminder that mentorship is a powerful force, capable of creating both extraordinary success and devastating consequences. The lessons passed from teacher to student can reshape entire industries and affect millions of lives. But perhaps the most important lesson of all is one that Bumpy Johnson never lived long enough to teach. True power isn't measured by how much you can accumulate, but by how long you can keep it.